Great. What do you want to talk about today?
What I want to talk about today is kind of like a follow-up from last week. What podcast format should you choose? And I'll explain why it's a follow-up. And I want to just go through what people should be thinking about when they're choosing a podcast format and the different types that there are. So what do you want to talk about today?
Well, I started teaching a new sales and marketing class. I teach that introductory sales and marketing class. And it's very skewed. Well, not very skewed. My first session in particular is skewed towards entrepreneurs and thinking like an entrepreneur. It's actually have a little bit of a rant that I do. I take some liberty at the beginning of the class and do a little bit of a rant that kind of deals with colonial mentalities as it pertains to businesses and how, coming from a history of a colony, you kind of begin to think a particular kind of way when you think about business, just like anything else. It has an impact, and unless you recognize its impact, a lot of times businesses will just follow a model, which technically is a colonial model, which wouldn't always serve the post-colonial nation. So you see, it gets a little bit ranty. So
yeah, you're in rant mode right now. Actually, this is the longest intro you've ever done.
And I was thinking about that coming out of that class, and actually what it made me think about is entrepreneurs and starting a business and what that means. And I kind of thought about an article I wrote a couple of years ago about should I
wait, hold on. We in this already? That's what we're doing?
No, we're not in it. So
we're not in it? Wait, well, let's this is really ranty for real. This is really ranty.
So what it led to and what I'm going to talk about, or what I want us to talk about this morning, is the question is, should I start a business? That's the question.
Oh, that's the question. All right. So since you're so very passionate about this week you could go ahead and go first.
It's a little bit of a rant, I admit, but it leads to a very important question, because a lot of times people don't know if they should be starting a business, if they should be moving into that entrepreneurial phase. A lot of people are saying, you should get some kind of entrepreneurial exposure. You should be in a position where you want to start a business because the job market is becoming so unpredictable. Mm-hmm. But I also don't know if that is for everybody. I mean, we've been entrepreneurs now for a number of years. And one of the first things I thought is, if you have to ask the question, the answer is probably no. Mm-hmm. You probably, if you're concerned enough, the answer is probably no. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not for the weary. And so that's the easy answer. If you're thinking too hard about it, maybe you should stick with where you feel comfortable and where you feel you can continue to perform.
Right.
In Relay Studios, so Relay Studios has been a going concern now for 15 years? Just about that. And you probably would have been on your own even before that. So you probably have been a business owner, an entrepreneur for about 15 to 20 years, somewhere between 15 and 20 years.
Yeah, I was in 08. 08 is when I started full time.
Right. So that's 16 years.
18
years. Yeah. So we've been doing this for a while, and I just wanted to I actually, if I'm being honest, the first business I started, I was still in school. I was in secondary school, and I would buy, and this is the basis of the entrepreneur, right? You get inputs. Inputs are usually characterized by capital and labor. So I would take my capital, which is like about $20. So I go into the Frederick Street Drag Mall, go to the guy selling what we would call Rasta oil, perfumed oil. Then I'll go to the other guy and buy the bottles, go home, bottle it out. So that's capital, labor. And then I'll go in school and sell it and make small profit, but still was a profit. And so in a sense, I feel like entrepreneurs kind of know from an early age that there's something inside of them that says this is the thing that will be a big part of your life. However, there are other little things I feel people can kind of look for and pay attention to to determine whether or not they should start their own business and move over into their own business. Now, before I kind of talk about those, I just want to talk about one little anecdote about when we were starting Relate Studios. And we made a lot of plans and we counted a lot of figures. And we were like, if you have to do this, this is how much we have to earn, and this is how we're going to earn it. And ultimately, the point at which the decision was made, those things, I don't want to say they didn't apply, but the decision just had to be made whether or not those predictions panned out or not, and they actually didn't pan out the way we wanted it to in the first six to 9 months. However, it was absolutely the right decision at the time, and I would, even knowing what I know, I would definitely take the same decision again. All right. Yeah. So a couple of things that you have to think about when you going to start your own business. This word is a little bit tricky because you sometimes don't like this word. And I too find it's a strong word for some of the things that we do, but the word is passion.
Okay.
And I know in a real sense, passion for anything outside of your wife and kids kind of feels like, if you really track the meaning of the word passion, it kind of feels like, maybe I don't have passion for that. But that's the word that best describes what is necessary to kind of push through some of the harder times when you're running a business. So it requires a lot of time and effort. And if you're not willing, if there's not something inside of you that drives you beyond immediate gratification or some kind of promise, especially when you do a lot of the work in absence of a salary. So you're not saying, well, I have to do this because I have to keep this job, because I have to get my salary at the end of the month. It's like you literally have to power. And if we could say passion is like an engine, so you need that engine inside of you that's going to run regardless of if you're going to get fired or hired or paid or not. It's just internal motivation that needs to happen. Yeah. So the other thing I think is important that kind of ties in with that is risk tolerance, because you will not be getting a salary at the end of the month. You will be risking time. You will be risking resources. You will be risking income. You have to put in your money into the business. So that's your investment. You're risking those things. And so you have to have a certain level of risk tolerance. If you have no risk tolerance, maybe entrepreneurship is not for you. Yeah. How much risk tolerance do you think you have?
I don't know. That's why I really don't. Listen, I was thinking about it this morning, so I'll look at tracking some emails we've been getting back and forth from a possible client. So we've been hired as a third party to do something for them, and I've been looking at the emails, and I saw an email. At first, when they sent email to us, I thought this will lead nowhere. This is not going to go anywhere. I am very cynical like that. I would look at an email and just judge somebody, like say, you don't have money to pay us. I would say that. It's unfortunate, but sometimes I do that, right? At that point, I say, I given it to you because you have a lot of patience and tolerance, and we'll go through that process and see what happens, right? And we've been going through the process for weeks now. And finally, the person said, all right, let's book it. And then minutes later, I see them say, wait, hold on. Let's not do this right now. Things have changed. And in terms of, and I will tie that to risk tolerance, in terms of some things I don't think of as a risk, I think of it as we need to do this. Like this is just what we have to do. But I don't know how to quantify that. I don't know what that is. Like, would I risk my family? I don't think so. Would I risk money to try something? Yes, I would do that. I would be like, if we have money saved up, I would say, let's take, like right now we're thinking about getting a physical space and getting a studio. People might say you're crazy at this time where things are in a downturn, and they might say that. And I would say, I feel strongly about this. Let's take a lot of the money that we have saved and dump it into trying to get a property or get a place or rent a place. I would say something like that. I would look at the financials and say, this doesn't make financial sense, really, but I feel that this is what we need to do now. And some of it does not make sense sometimes. Right. Just dump it into it. Let's do it. So that's the type of risk that I would take generally.
Right. that dovetails into my next point very nicely, because the next point is all about finances. Starting a business is going to cost you money, and I'm glad you brought up the whole issue about what you're willing to risk for the business, because a lot of times you have to plan for, particularly if you have a family. I think younger people, this is definitely more suited to young people. You can take a lot more risk. If you're at home, you're still living with your parents, take the risk at that time. Because when you have a family, you then have to think about, you can't risk the life and status, and not just status, but the type of life your kids have become accustomed to. So you're a lot less likely to risk that. But you don't want to think about the finances. So you want to put things in place. So don't ever assume you're going to make money in the first year. Don't just assume that, well, this is a fantastic idea. There are very few businesses that can just hit the ground running and start making. And when I say make money, don't confuse revenue with profit, which a lot of people do. So like you ask somebody, how much money you think you're going to make from this? And what they start adding up is revenue. But then they forget they have expenses, they have taxes, you have all kinds of things that then take from your revenue, and it's not actual profit. So you have to keep that in mind. So you kind of have to think about your finances, plan out your finances, plan for not making money. So in other words, in investment, they talk about runway. So when somebody invests in a company, like you invest in a new tech company like Cloud AI or something like that, a lot of times they lose money for years. And they have to have something called runway, which is money to cover expenses until you become profitable, or until you get that next tranche of investment from somebody who thinks your business is going to do well in the future. So you have to kind of think about that, plan that out. I think when we were starting Relay Studios, we did 6 months, if I remember correctly. We kind of like make sure we could handle things for 6 months. I think you were full time in the business. I was coming from a part-time reality, and then we were going to start coming out of flow, and we're going to start Relay Studios. And we said, look, we need to be covered for like six months, which I think we were. Although some of the other numbers didn't pan out, but it ended up working out. So yeah, that's a big thing to think about. What was your finances going to be like for the coming period?
You know what? I think when we started, one of the things that was really very, very important is that, and let me tie it back into marketing now, where I had already built up somewhat of some momentum and a reputation inside of this space that we were going into, because we started as essentially wedding photographers, and there was infrastructure already. There was a website, there were referrals happening, we were being talked about. There was this push to become a part of the Wedding Photojournalists Association and Fearless Photographers. There were a few things that were happening already that gave the business momentum, that we didn't have to start from a dead stop. And those things were built out even before, I would say since 2006, those things were being built up. So 2006 to 2008 was when the business first started, the original version of it, I would say. And then from 2008 to 2011 is when we went from that version to the version that I was in by myself, until sometime in between that, you began to do some part-time things. And then we decided, okay, now we can both go full-time.
Yeah.
And but there was momentum. We didn't start from a dead stop. It's not like we had an idea and left our jobs to start the thing. The business already had. In fact, I think we had contracts that were supposed to be fulfilled. Like we had weddings booked in the future. So we extrapolated that into what profit we would make or what revenue we would have. And that was very useful in saying, well, we could do this for this length of time as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I would recommend to people that they be a little bit cautious. Don't be too quick to leave your job. You could, so like back in the days, my dad used to call it a PJ. And nowadays the terminology they use is side hustle. So always think about growth, but don't be afraid of starting a side hustle. And then there comes a point in time where you have to switch over the level of effort from the side hustle, from the regular job to the side hustle. And that period a lot of times indicate when you need to transition to full-time into the business. But that's a key thing that you also have to think about, like, when do I transition full-time? So I recommend treating it like a side hustle, but not permanently like a side hustle. I know there are some things that people do permanently as a side hustle, but if you're an entrepreneur, you want to build a business and you want a business that could survive and grow and develop. So if you're in that category, not just, oh, let me make a few extra dollars, but you want to grow a business, build a brand, then you have to think about, when do I transition my efforts? Because there's a point, there's almost like literal crossroads. So if you think about a graph, there's a point where the graph switches in terms of effort. And the permanent or the job starts getting less effort, and the side hustle starts getting more effort. And that crossover point is probably when you should stop working for whoever you're working for. Because what you will begin to do is to diminish what you're giving to them. It'll actually be unfair to the job, especially if the people who you're working for don't know that this is what you plan to do. And that you had an experience with that, which you had a very good experience, which most people don't have, which is one of your bosses from your job knew you had to transition into your own business and was fully supportive. Most people don't get that opportunity. Tell us about how that was for you.
Yeah, so I actually came into the business with them knowing that at some point I would leave. The very interesting thing about that is that I didn't know what state I would leave in or what I would leave to do. But somehow the idea of me being an entrepreneur was always floating around. And I came to the business with them knowing that. And we didn't know when it would happen. We didn't know what I would be. When I came to the business, photography wasn't even a thing. It was not even a thing. I came in 2004. Photography was not on my radar as a way to start a business. But between 2004 and 2006, it just definitely became the option that it started off as, which speaks to another thing of what you start off with is not where you will end up with in business a lot of times. So we started off with photography. Now that's the least of what we do in terms of our service offerings, I would say. But I would say the transition for me inside of that business, we had an open dialogue with what things were happening. And the closer I came to the point where I knew I had to leave, I would update them. So it was like a year update, 6-month update. And when we hit the 3-month update, then we started to put things in place in order for me to transition out of being an employee to going full time. And they were fully on board with that. And in fact, when I left the job officially, I stopped being a salaried employee. I came back as a contractor to finish up some projects as well. So that was part of the transition.
Right. Yeah, that's good that you were able to have that kind of experience. Not a lot of employees think that way. I remember, as you mentioned it, a particular boss came to mind. I wasn't actually leaving to start a business, but I was going to another job. And as the young people say, my boss was real salty and said some disparaging things at the time. I was like, well, if you had provided better, maybe I would have stayed. But she didn't even make an offer to do better. She just kind of said negative things. Let me leave it at that. She said a bunch of negative things.
Yeah.
All right. So a couple other things you need to think about. So far we've talked about risk tolerance. We've talked about finances. We've talked about passion. Let me talk about something that I sometimes get a little bit ranty for also, which is the whole issue of markets and market research. So the article I wrote talks about market research, but I've since kind of refined that thing. It's not so much about market research, it's about filling a gap. There are too many Me Too businesses. And what do I mean by Me Too businesses? There are too many businesses that are just doing something, the same thing that somebody else is doing. And real entrepreneurs should find the gap in the market as opposed to positioning themselves. Now, you can position yourself against competition. So if this person is doing this, so if this person is red, you can say you're blue. And sometimes that works. But more times than not, what entrepreneurs should be looking for is a gap in the market, a way of doing something that nobody else is doing, providing a product or providing a service that nobody else is doing, distinguishing yourself with a particular brand in a way that nobody else is doing. So you're looking for that gap in the market. So you're not just importing at one price, marking up, selling at another price, but you're actually innovating inside of the business. And you could innovate. People think innovation and they think, well, I can't do IT. Well, innovation is not only about technology. You can innovate technology, yes, that technology could be applied to manufacturing process. That technology could be applied to features on your product or service. But you could also apply it to the way you distribute your product. You could also apply it to the way you deliver service or the way you augment service. So there are a number of ways for you to differentiate yourself. So I was having this conversation last week with someone, and I brought up, I can't remember her name. We did the podcast with Gerard and Sorbet young lady.
Sorbet, Renee. Yeah.
Renee. So I talked about Renee. So sorbets are not new. She didn't innovate in terms of what a sorbet is. But she innovated.
Ice cream.
Yeah, ice cream, sorbet, those things existed, right? So you decide to sell that. You don't just say, well, I'm selling ice cream. You have to find a way to distinguish yourself. And she did that, I would say, by two things. I haven't done a deep dive on her business, but the two things that stand out to me that have been innovative was her way of marketing and her formulations for the different flavors. And those two things allow her to target a particular gap in the market. So if you're going to start a business, that's what you should be looking for. That's going to increase your potential for success exponentially. Like, find a gap in the market. Nobody's doing it this way. Nobody's calling it this. Nobody's approaching it in this particular way. Or nobody's had this idea. Nobody's solved this problem. Some people didn't even realize it was a problem. And then you as an entrepreneur could come in and communicate in a way that people realize, oh, there's a problem. So now I need to solve it. And there you are with the solution to that problem. And I think that's a big, big deal. So I talk about market research in the article, but market research also from the perspective of, first of all, identifying a clear gap in the market that you could fit your brand into and distinguish yourself from your competitors.
Right. That is a positioning thing. And I think that's very important, finding that gap. Sometimes it's really difficult to find a gap. It's really, really difficult. And you're right. A lot of people basically have Me Too businesses in the sense that they don't really try to be original. And you complain a lot about this. The basis of their business is that let's just suppose as a retailer, they bring in something, mark it up, sell it back. And that's the basis of the business. And it's a race to the bottom because everybody's getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And you might try to find a cheaper supplier. So it's basically people are hiding their suppliers. People are trying to cut corners, and the customer ends up getting a lower quality product overall. And it really favors the people who already have resources because they could sell cheap until everybody else dies, and then they could just raise the price again. So it's not advantageous for smaller businesses to get into a lot of Me Too businesses because they will always find it difficult to compete, even with great marketing. So finding a good gap is always a good thing to consider. And also I think it's important that you understand your horizontal versus your vertical, where you're specializing in the thing that you do, the thing that you are focused on, the service or the product that you offer. That's your vertical. And then your horizontal is the type of people that you might serve. So let's just suppose you serve only insurance companies. That would be the people that you specialize in. That's part of your positioning. And let's just suppose for you do accounting for them. Then that's your vertical. What you do is this, and who you serve is that. And at that intersection, you'll find it helps you position yourself properly. And maybe you could find a specialized gap inside of that in order to position yourself in a way that you need to in the market to build out your business.
Yeah, that's an important point. And I just want to make one additional point to that, which is a lot of times people start businesses based on what they're good at. And while I'm not negating skills and I'm not negating experience, what you're good at might not necessarily be what the market wants. So you might say, oh, I'm going to get into a cake business, for example, or I'm going to get into doubles or something like that. Yeah, well, we have that. We have that. So what can you do differently? And don't just say, well, I'm going into the market that best reflects my skills. A lot of times you have to find the gap in the market and you may need to augment your skills. It would be a perfect situation if you can find a gap in the market that absolutely matches your skills, and then you can push forward. That's best case scenario. But don't just start the business with, oh, I'm good at this, so this is the business I'm going to start. There might not be a market for it. So you have to determine whether or not there's a market for what you are good at. And sometimes you may have to adjust your skill set, training, upskilling, augmenting your skill set and your experience so that you can better serve that particular niche in the market.
Yeah. And that's an ongoing process that never really stops. That you could find something, it does well for a while, and then inevitably people will see it working and they kind of copy you. Yeah. So you have to continually search for that thing. Hopefully the advantage you get is being first to market or being somebody who does it really, really well because you have the experience doing it. And that gives you some type of advantage, which is what happened with us with wedding photography. Our particular choice, our particular style, we were very documentary focused and people loved that. And we found that afterwards, a lot of people try to do the same style. Doing that really well was rare in the market. And so we stood out. So much so that we got a lot of destination weddings, foreign clients was able to travel because that specific type of wedding photography in the Caribbean was not widely done. And so we positioned ourselves a particular way, and that really helped us do well with that particular service initially.
Yeah, very, very true. Just to wrap up now, so just in conclusion, in terms of this discussion, being an entrepreneur also means you need to have a lot of different skills because you end up doing a lot on your own. Especially in today's market, CEOs of particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, they have to do a lot of marketing themselves. They have to do the HR. They have to do the content creation. And so you have to be good at a number of different things. You have to understand finances. You have to have leadership skills because you have to be able to motivate and lead staff, get them productive. And so that's the other consideration. All the skills necessary to really be a business leader and to build a business that you may want to build. And tied into that is also recognize when you no longer necessarily have to do everything. So there comes a point in time, so long as your business is growing, you have to begin to hire staff to help you take your business to the next level, because at some point in time, you're going to burn out trying to do everything on your own. Yeah?
Yeah.
So just to answer the question, should I start a business? For the faint of heart, the answer is no. And if you really feel motivated, particularly if it's something that you've been thinking about for a while, go forward and get it done. But be cautious and be calculated and deliberate. That's a big point. Be very deliberate in everything that you do.
All right. Good stuff. All right. I know last week we spoke about different methods to create video content. I spoke about the S-type, B-type, C-type, which is the spontaneous creator, batch creator, and co-creator. If you missed that, go back and listen to the episode from last week and it'll update you on what that is. And this week I wanted to expand specifically on the co-creator, and that's a person who creates long-form video and then takes clips of those videos in order to distribute that across various platforms to schedule their content. But today I wanted to talk specifically about podcasts because that is a service that we have been offering and we are now leaning more into that. I'm going to talk about choosing the right format for you if you do want to start a podcast, and because maybe people know only one type and they need to be exposed to maybe there are other options that they can have if they want to create this long form piece of content for their business. So let me touch on the benefits of a podcast a little bit, and it will help people set their minds as to whether or not this might be something for them. So the benefits of a podcast generally are it helps build authority. And how does it do that? You get to demonstrate your depth of expertise because you can get deeper into topics like what we are doing right now. This is a live recorded podcast, but we're going to repurpose it into a YouTube video and then short clips later on. So you get to talk about things in depth. And the second thing that it does that is really good is that it helps build your brand and it helps build relationships. So brand and relationship building with your exact clients. So you spend more time with the people who matter to your business, and that helps you get that relationship built. It helps talk about your brand as well, right? There are many reasons you can do a podcast. We're not going to get into that today because that's like a discussion you have to have with somebody who is helping you make it, or your marketing team or whoever is involved in that process, because the decision to make it is a big one, whether you want to do it or not. but there are many reasons you can do it and many reasons that it could be useful to you. So there are kind of 5 main formats of podcasting that are pretty popular, some more than others. And what I'm going to aim to do is help you narrow down what might work for you based on the descriptions, and some you may be familiar with already. So there is a bit of an acronym. It's not really an acronym, but I've turned it into an acronym because what is life without acronyms? It's Cinch, which is SICNH. So the types of podcasts are solo podcast, the interview podcast, it's co-hosted podcast, there is narrative, and then there is hybrid podcast. So I'm going to walk through all of those and the features and let you get exposed to a bit of why things are done in the way they are when you look to create a podcast and what format that might be. So let's first look at the solo podcast. I have this section called The Vibe. The vibe of a solo podcast is one person, one mic, sharing direct expertise and opinions. So that's one person, one mic, sharing direct expertise and opinions. And by the way, when I'm talking about these, when I say podcast, traditionally podcasts were audio.
Audio, yeah.
But think about video when I talk about this. Think about something you can see as well, being on
definitely.
camera.
Even the podcast platforms are moving into video podcasts in a big way as part of what they're offering.
Correct. So YouTube has done this. Spotify has done this. Well, YouTube has always been like that. Spotify has done this, and Apple is now doing this, going to video. So the pros of a solo podcast is that you have total creative control generally. Of course, you may have a team that will help you make it, but you have total creative control, and you have no such things as scheduling conflicts other than internal, and it helps you build a very strong personal brand. So if it's just you on the camera, they're seeing you, hearing you, talking about the topics that you or your company needs, it helps build your personal brand. And you can engineer the podcast specifically to do that. The cons of a solo podcast is that it's a lot of pressure, right? Because it's only you are the one that it falls upon to create. And if you're sick, if for some reason you have some conflict, you have scheduling conflicts or whatever it might be, you need to have the energy and still create the thing when it's required. All the weight is on your shoulder as a specific person hosting the solo podcast. Another challenge is that it's likely that engagement can be hard to keep up when you have to monologue for half an hour, 30 minutes without any second voice to break it up. So if I don't want to talk, I just say, Ayinde, what do you think about this?
Right.
And Ayinde would insert his opinion here. So there's a conversation, there's a back and forth, right? So some examples of that locally. This is in Trinidad and Tobago. Digipreneur by Karen Rose, Digipreneur FM, right? That focuses on digital entrepreneurship. Many people will know this podcast because it has been the #1 podcast for business in the Caribbean, a few Caribbean islands and in the Caribbean for a little while. It focuses on entrepreneurship, digital entrepreneurship, e-commerce marketing strategies for the Caribbean. Internationally, this podcast is one of my favorite podcasts, probably my top 3. Is Nudge by Phil Agnew. He was already a guest on my podcast, Useful Creator. It's a behavioral science podcast. And for those who don't know, I am big into behavioral science because that's part of how I feel marketing needs to be executed with that in mind. And he has the #1 marketing podcast in the UK. It's a solo podcast, just him alone. And there are some elements to it that will fall into another category, but it's mainly him a solo podcast. He does kind of interview people. He does kind of have narrative stuff in there, which we'll get into just now, but it mainly is a solo podcast. Let's look at the second type of podcast you can have. The second type of podcast you can have is interview podcast. So that's S and this is I. So the vibe of that is that a host brings on guests to share their unique expertise or story. A host brings on guests to share their unique expertise or story. And so the pros of that is that you have a built-in audience. If you get someone who's really popular, they will follow that person to your podcast. So that is one of the things, especially if they promote it. They promote that they're going on X person's podcast. Right. It really helps to grow your audience. So you get not the halo effect. You get, what do you call that effect again? When people, you get other people from other people. what do you call that?
Borrowed attention.
Borrowed attention, borrowed authority. You get that effect. That's part of behavioral science, by the way. You get that effect happening where people bring their crowd to you. You get networking opportunities. Some of the people who have been on my podcast, we've eventually done work with. And you get diverse perspectives on topics because people are going to approach things different to the way you might want to approach it. Right? The cons of an interview podcast is that interviewing is a skill. And a lot of people are not good at it initially. It is a skill. There's a gap in between where you start and where you want to end up to be a great interviewer. And the only way you can improve that is by actually interviewing people. And sometimes you're bad at it. you're bad at it initially.
Right. Would you say that how useful content creation podcast mainly was inside of this silo of interviews?
Yeah. So when I started off, it started off as a live show first. So useful content creation was a live show first. And I did that for two reasons. I did that because I didn't want to try and re-edit anything, which I eventually had to do, by the way. It was really complex at the beginning. And I wouldn't explain what that is, maybe in another episode. But the second part is that I wanted to get good at just talking to people and getting experience of doing it live without having to try and edit it. So I wanted to practice, essentially. That's why it was done that way in the first instance. So it was part of this whole developing my interview skill as well.
So the next one is co-hosted.
Co-hosted. Before I do hosted, let me just talk about a couple of the cons again. For the cons of interviews, I mentioned it's hard to stay consistent enough to get good sometimes, and you might give up. Most podcasts fail within the first 7 to 10 episodes anyway, and that might be one thing that might discourage you. You have to book people, so you have to have a booking system that gets people on board, and it has to be sequenced. And I wrote a post on LinkedIn yesterday about the same Phil Agnew who I mentioned earlier, who I booked on my podcast, and it took an entire year to get him onto the podcast. So if you think you're going to talk to somebody one week and have them on the podcast the other week, that is not usually what happens. It could happen, but that is not usually what happens. You have to have booking all the way in advance and schedule people. It really is very challenging sometimes. And then to get the people who are going to talk about the topics that you want, if you have a very niche podcast, like for example, if your podcast is rebuilding cars or automotive restoration, you have to get experts in that field. And because you have to get experts in that field, it becomes more difficult to find people who can talk with authority about those things, interesting people who are well known. And that is also a challenge. If you have general knowledge things like for example, like a Joe Rogan, which is just a bunch of interesting people, it becomes easier. But anytime it's niche, if it's marketing, if it's SEO, interviewing people on those particular topics, booking guests like that becomes increasingly hard as you go through more people, because there are people who are going to be popular. You're going to run through your first 20 people fast. And then half of those people don't want to come on your show because you're a nobody.
Right.
And then eventually you get them, but you're going to have to find ways to book people in that instance. Yeah. So some local examples of that are the very popular these days Corey Shepherd podcast, right? He does some real unfiltered Caribbean rooted conversations that celebrate the culture, and he highlights these compelling voices. His own is more general. He does a lot of entertainers and things of that nature. I've had some very popular people on the podcast already. One podcast that I like that is like this is the Creator Science podcast with Jay Klaus. He teaches creators how to build sturdy businesses through observation, experimentation, and iteration. Really, really excellent podcast. Very detailed. Goes through step by step about how to build certain things as a content creator or somebody with a creator business. And of course, I will put inside there my podcast, the Useful Creator Podcast. And I talk to Caribbean creators and professionals about how to use videos to grow their career, build their full-time businesses, and unpack the mindsets and strategies and the creative process surrounding that. So those are some podcasts that I like. I have to like my own podcast. It's mandatory, right? The last in the big three, and I'll just run through the other ones really, really quickly after this. The last in the big three is the co-hosted podcast, of which you are observing and watching right now.
Right.
The vibe of that is two or more people with chemistry having a structured discussion of sorts, right? Usually that's how it goes. The pros of that is that if you have natural chemistry, you can share the workload. and you have varied viewpoints to keep the listener engaged. The cons of that is finding the right person. That is like finding the right person you can co-host with is always a challenge because people may do the same thing, but they may have conflicting perspectives. They may not flow together well. And they're talking about booking time and commitment and all those different things. It could fall apart fast if you don't have somebody, if you don't find the right person.
I notice a lot of hip hop podcasts rely a lot on the interaction between the co-hosts.
Correct.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of their traction comes from the either good interaction or antagonistic interaction, but they lean heavily into that. So like I feel like the thing that drives those types of podcasts are the interaction of the relationships of the co-hosts. And they
Right.
you have 2 to 3, sometimes 4 co-hosts at the same time. But it's interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, and on those hip hop podcasts, which are not necessarily business podcasts, but they have the principle of having people co-hosted. The co-hosts have stories. They have stories that they tell, and they often riff off of each other. And sometimes Ayinde has a story that I am very interested to hear, so I'm listening as he's telling it, and vice versa. He knows things about me that he could ask, that like stories I've told him before, and he could ask that, and he will make me tell a story that will be interesting to the listeners, and they'll teach a lesson. And the same thing will happen here. So the chemistry is very important, and finding someone who you can really have these conversations with is very important. Yeah. The last con I would say is alignment. Over time, your expertise or your business goals might diverge, making it harder to stay on the same page. And that is a risk that you'll run with having a co-host who you want to build with over a long period of time. Let me give you some examples of podcasts like these. My favorite co-hosted podcast, and probably my favorite podcast, not right now, has been for a long time, is Two Bubs. That is number 2 Bubs with David C. Baker and Blair Enns. These are deep, focused conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship. So you will understand why that's important to me. It teaches you how to build a creative business, and they also talk about positioning too. So that's one of my favorite podcasts that I listen to every time they release an episode. It's short, normally 25 to 30 minutes, and it's only in audio. Although they put the audio on YouTube, it's only in audio. So I normally listen to that when I go out and exercise and do different things. The last example I will talk about is our podcast. It's Good to Relate. It's Ayinde and myself. We take each episode to explore at least 2 topics on marketing and content strategy. And our goal is to inspire and teach Caribbean businesses how to use content and marketing to build long-term successful businesses. That is what we are about. As a bonus, I'll mention This Old Marketing by Joe Polizzi and Robert Rose, which is a mix of industry news, rants, and marketing history. I'll just mention that. That's another co-hosted podcast. So let me just run through the last 2 formats. I wouldn't really dwell too much on them. There is a narrative podcast format, which is basically audio storytelling. It's less of a back and forth and more of a scripted journey that the podcast host will talk about.
So an example of that one. So
there are a few examples of that. I don't really listen to any of these. So there's something called Estong, which is a deep novel-like look into the life of a man in a small town. There's Radiolab, which is a high production show that blends science, philosophy, and incredible sound design to explain complex ideas.
Is it that the topics can be factual or fiction?
Fact or fiction. It could be non-fiction, it could be fiction. And so you get like this narrative type thing. And the thing I like about it is that those podcasts have to be designed well. You have to think about the audio and the story, and it's very engaging if you like that type of thing. People who read books might enjoy this type of podcast. Right. How this will work for business, though, I am not sure, but it is an option if you want to get into that type of thing. I will put the pros and cons in our article at itsgoodtorelate.com when I post it. So I would not go through the pros and cons right now because we're running out of time a little bit. And the last one I'll talk about is the hybrid or live format. live is a kind of a misnomer because a hybrid doesn't have to be live, but basically taking any of the other formats and doing it in front of a live audience and then repurposing that video and audio. So right now we're doing this live, but we're doing it co-hosted. So that is like a hybrid format that you'll have. The pros and cons of that I will put in the article as well. If you want to read what those pros and cons of having a format like we have here, then you go read that at itsgoodtorelate.com when the episode drops on the website, right? And some honorable mentions for formats are things like docu-podcast, roundtable, or panel discussions, which could kind of be considered a co-hosted podcast. And you have variety shows, which the first version of the Uso content creation show was kind of a variety show. Yeah. And so that's it. I ran through it really fast. I know we didn't have a lot of time to talk about it, but do you have any thoughts, Ayinde?
Yeah, I like how you broke down the 5 different formats. I think it communicates clearly different options available for people in general creating content and creating podcasts, but also specifically for CEOs thinking about how can I create podcasts that are going to have impact on my business. And I think one of the things you mentioned that I just wanted to reiterate was the impact that podcasts will have on your business, which I think leads heavily into developing relationships with your target audience. A podcast is such a deep dive thing and is a commitment. It's not like an ad where 100,000 people are going to see it. However, how many of that 100,000 are actually going to react to that ad or have some kind of call to action as a result of that? But when you have a podcast, a lot of times people choosing to listen to you. Mm-hmm. So that alone says a lot about the relationship because they're willing to commit at least 15 minutes to listen to you, sometimes an hour, sometimes more than that. And so the level of commitment to that relationship is high, and therefore the level of impact of that relationship would be high. So I think it is very good from that perspective, helping CEOs build relationships with their target audience, build relationships with the potential customers of their businesses. Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely. All right, great. So what did we learn today, Ayinde?
If you want to start a business, you have to think long and hard because you probably shouldn't be starting a business. It's not an easy road. And any entrepreneur listening to this would agree with me, it's not easy. But if you feel that clear call towards this particular type of life, you have to answer the call because you're going to be frustrated otherwise. So ultimately, you have to make the decision of what is good for your life, for your family. Just some things to think about when you're starting a business. Have some level of passion for the thing that you're getting into so that it can drive you in times where there's zero other types of motivation coming towards you. Yeah. So that's the first thing. And also think about your finances, managing your finances. Think about the skill set that you might have. You need to have a particular set of skills. A lot of times in early businesses, you have to do multiple things, chief cook and bottle washer, as we say here in Trinidad and Tobago. And the main thing I think that you have to remember is, am I filling a gap? How am I being unique in the market? And how is that allowing me to stand apart from my competition? And it has to be something that's in the market. Marketers or entrepreneurs should be marketers, and marketers always start in the market. What is happening in the market? Yeah. And then we learn some stuff about podcasts too, particularly what Cinch stands for, SINCH. What are those, Juma?
Well, SICNH is in the wrong order. They're still pronounced the same way. So it talks about solo podcasts, interview podcasts, co-hosted podcasts, narrative, and then we have hybrid. So yeah, those are the types of podcasts. Generally, you would find those are the popular ones. Most people know about interview podcasts because those are the kind of sexy podcasts, and they know about Diary of a CEO, but there are other types that you can get into. I wouldn't round that up. I will leave that for the website. I would say go check out the article and get the summary of everything that we said. And it should tell you exactly, everything will be there for you to look at and read over and use for your own edification inside of your business and for your marketing. All right, so I think that's it for us today. Thanks everyone for joining us on It's Good to Relate. And don't forget again to go and check out our episodes at itsgoodtorelate.com.
Thank you everyone for listening to our podcast, and we'll see you next time.